Great. Well, good morning, Aryasara. It's great to be here with you. And thanks so much for offering your time to support teachers in Essex, developing their subject knowledge for Buddhism in relation to the agreed syllabus. We're going to talk through some of the big ideas that underpin Buddhism. We won't be able to cover everything, and the idea here is that we're trying to demystify some bits of Buddhism, I guess, to make teachers increase teacher confidence, really, to empower teachers to be able to lead their own subject knowledge development and to feel more confident using Buddhism as one of the faiths to lead their discussions around the inquiries that frame the new syllabus, and also to make and to choose which other faiths, religions, belief systems, worldviews to compare Buddhism with. So we're going to spend some time just looking at the core content that is recommended, and that is recommended rather than compulsory with the new syllabus. So we've kind of collected some ideas together that we think kind of get to the core of Buddhism, and then we'll talk through a couple of the big questions that teachers can choose to lead their inquiries. So the way the syllabus is set up is they do an inquiry every half term, or 5 out of the 6 half terms. There's a big question which they'll use to underpin, and they'll unpack that over time. So I'm going to share my screen and so here we go. All right, so we're looking. This is one of 7 interviews which are available or will be available to go along with other walkthroughs of the core subject knowledge which these slides support. So we are today going to talk from time to time and focus through the kind of philosophical lens, looking at the philosophy that underpins Buddhism. We'll be asking and talking about theological questions, so kind of the nuts and bolts of the religion. And we'll also be thinking about the human social sciences. So, what's the impact in the world today? How does a Buddhist go about deciding how to live their life and to make moral and ethical decisions and so on? So here is the core knowledge broken into theology, philosophy, and human social sciences, which we think that if teachers had a good understanding of, would be able to deliver good quality Buddhism. Now, is there anything here that you thought was particularly relevant? What do you think that teachers need to really know?
I think within Buddhism, it's the kind of the difference with Buddhism, perhaps with many other religions, is the concept of God or non-creator God, that aspect of it. And then there's the real understanding, I think, and of one of the core teachings of Buddhism, which is described as conditioned co-production. And sounds complicated, and that is quite difficult to grasp. But those are probably some of the fundamental differences between Buddhism and many of the other religions that people may come across. So, yeah, I would suggest something like that as well. Yeah.
And so in Buddhism, you have got Buddhists will look to the teachings of the Buddha,
Yeah.
Which are collected in the Dhammapada. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. So, but that's not. There isn't one book that Buddhists would look to kind of guide their actions, is there?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, you'd have the Pali Canon. The Dhammapada is one aspect of the Pali Canon, and there are a number of different sections to that as well. So there's quite a volume of work there, which are the sayings of the Buddha, but it's so easy to get lost in the complexity of that and what's available. But the Dhammapada is possibly the most common one, and perhaps even the most accessible one. So that's why it's more commonly known. Yeah.
Okay, so there are some texts that teachers could look to, and we might go to discuss a little bit about those, because we've got the Jakarta Tales recommended as well. that teachers can look to. And there's some good stories out there that can underpin, like there is with every faith. And the Dhammapada, of course, like, I immediately think about the hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and how you've got that kind of, there are big characters. Sometimes one main character within each faith, and there are things that they said or stories they told, and then we can use those to underpin our teaching. So now we have this idea of there being no God within Buddhism. That's always an interesting idea, I think, for teachers, because when we talk, actually we wouldn't be really, if we describe Buddhism as a religion, then I often think of it more as a belief system than a religion. How do you take that?
Yeah, it's interesting to pin down, really, isn't it? You could describe it as a journey. Some people may describe it as a way of life, but I'm not sure if that quite does it either. Yes, it's classified as a religion, but as you say, there isn't a belief in a creator God. So, yeah, I would describe it as personally for me more of a way of life, but it's an ongoing journey, implementing other aspects which we may discuss, the 5 precepts,
Yes.
and the aspects, of course, of going for refuge to the 3 jewels, being important as well. So it's encompassing all of that within your life daily.
Now you mentioned the 3 jewels there. So I just dragged in there a quick definition of that. So this is within Buddhism, like all religions, there are some numbers of things, right? It helps with, so we've got the 3 jewels, we've got the 5 precepts, we've got the eightfold path, and actually that can be a really good way into getting to grips with the nuts and bolts. If you have that laid out in front of you, like, okay, these are the rules. Now, it's not always helpful just to focus on the rules, but actually precepts, that's the concepts, that's the core ideas, and that helps us to get into the belief system there. So you've got the taking refuge in the Buddha. So what does that mean exactly, to take refuge in the Buddha?
Yeah, so we have 3 refuges, the first one being the Buddha. So there's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha, we go for refuge to the Buddha Shakyamuni in really more of the ideal of enlightenment, and someone who was born as we're born, gained enlightenment. And if it was possible for the Buddha to do it, then it's possible for us. So it's really there as an example to us, that it's possible. If the Buddha managed to do it, then there's the possibility it's there for all of us as well. So it's really just as a mark of respect and understanding, and really that aspect of it. So we go for refuge to him, as an example, as an exemplar, really.
That word refuge is quite interesting, isn't it? To take refuge in something, is that sort of safety, security. It, so it's and you mentioned there the idea of respect, looking up to, uh,
Mm-hmm.
not idolizing as such,
Mm-hmm.
but having as your kind of the person you look to.
Yeah.
You mentioned enlightenment. Now we throw around the word enlightenment. Often we enlighten me. We use that word, but within Buddhism, that concept, that ideal that's being sought, is an interesting one, and especially interesting where somebody might take on the role of a bodhisattva and deliberately delay their own enlightenment in order to help others. I think I've got that idea right.
Yeah.
So what is enlightenment?
So,
Oh,
well,
yes, it's a big question.
yeah, when you find that, when the Buddha tries to describe it, he actually describes what it's not quite often. So what he would actually say is, well, do you know this? Well, it's not like that. Do you? And really, the reason behind that is, and how can an enlightened person describe to an unenlightened person what enlightenment is? So that's quite difficult. But possibly one way of looking at it is seeing through the nature, seeing reality, seeing into the nature of how things really are in the world. So when you see through that and see the reality, as I said, of conditioned co-production, this being that becomes, etc., that saying from the Buddha, then that would reach into the area of enlightenment. So beyond duality, we would say about duality. So we very much see the world from our own perspective. You know, in many ways, it's almost like we are the center of the universe and everything else is around us. And in Buddhism, we work towards an understanding that that's just not the case, actually. So this notion of duality is, you know, you're out there and I'm here, and I want to grasp things. I want to push the things away that I don't want. I want to, and we actually find that actually conditioned co-production is about impermanence. And what the Buddha actually said is that all things are impermanent. So, and everything is in a flux of change. So if you go through life trying to maintain things, keep things, you will always trip yourself up, because actually everything's in a flux of change. So it's being penetrating through to really gain a deep understanding and knowledge of that would be really one way of working towards that aspect of enlightenment. So the breaking down of me here and you there, and the fact that actually everything's just interconnected.
So it's about interconnectedness of things, about detachment from the physical world, detachment from, or trying to realize that everything and everyone is interconnected. We often see that through meditation practices,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of, yeah, detaching yourself, but also connecting with others can be the focus of meditation practice, can't it?
Absolutely. That's one of the main, you know, the metta bhavana practice, the cultivation of love and kindness is about bringing different people into that meditation, which helps as well in breaking that kind of me and you and that barrier that can be there. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That concept of love and kindness is something which is an interesting thing to explore within all faiths. Really, it has a role somewhere, doesn't it? And
Mm.
okay, so we haven't talked about you now. Are you a member of the Sangha?
Yes. So I'm a member of the Sangha. Um, so when we go for refuge to the Sangha, so there's the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Sangha is one of the third refugees.
Mm.
There's actually two aspects to the Sangha. That when we say we go for refuge in that sort of almost like that purest term, it's the Arya Sangha. So Arya means those enlightened beings that have gone beyond, that have passed the Buddhist teachings down to us. So we go for refuge to the Arya Sangha. But Sangha can also mean just simply the spiritual community, those that come to a Buddhist center who practice with us, others that are on the journey practicing Buddhist as well. Because what we really need, I've heard it said quite a lot actually, is we don't actually need a guru or a great teacher. We just really need the help of somebody who's maybe just that little bit further advanced than we are along the journey. But we also need our horizontal friendships,
Mm.
those friends who can support and help us. So the Sangha becomes, it's very interesting when people come to our center, as an example, and they may be looking for meditation just to reduce stress. And within probably a few weeks, what they actually say is how important the Sangha is to them in friendship and support. And it's something that they weren't expecting to come across. So the Sangha as a refuge is really important. And in many ways, with going for refuge, it's also really that's the thing that we place the heart upon. It means sort of to us as Buddhists, it's the central act of a Buddhist is going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And you could really describe it in those terms, what we would place the heart upon.
It's so interesting what you say about somebody who is just slightly more developed than yourself. That really speaks to some core concepts within teaching and education. That idea of progression. We need the support of somebody who knows just a little bit more than us, who can take us
Mm.
to that next step. Um, and that idea of that kind of horizontal relationship with friends as well is fascinating. Now,
Mm.
you mentioned the Dharma several times over, and Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism can be known as dharmic faiths, dharmic belief systems, as opposed to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, that are known as often known as the Abrahamics, because they have Abraham as the kind of the founding father, who's you know, the catalyst, I guess. So, what is the Dharma?
The Dharma is a word that can cover a number of things, but in this context, the Dharma is the Buddhist teachings. So the teachings that have been handed down from the Buddha. So we mentioned the Dhammapada as an example. Um, um, but also really the teachings from other enlightened beings or great sort of teachers in the past. There are many others as well. So those would all come within the Dharma. So it's the teachings of the Buddha would be the main way to describe within this context of going for refuge to the
Mm.
Dharma would be the Buddhist teachings.
Okay. And that might be a Dharma might refer to something a little bit different if we were looking at Hinduism or
Yes.
Sikhism. And so we'd probably be talking about the rules, the teachings, the core ideas. And we often see a wheel um, as the symbol of Buddhism. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
The wheel often really is there to describe the Eightfold Path. That it's often the representation of the Eightfold Path and the turning of the wheel or the turning of the Dharma. So you'll often see maybe a picture of a Buddha or see a statue of a Buddha, and if they've got a mudra like that, it's the teaching mudra, it's the turning of the wheel, which represents the first sort of discourse of the Buddha, which was the Four Noble Truths. And the fourth of the Noble Truths is the Eightfold Path, um, which I believe you've got on the screen at the moment there. So yes, that's the representation of the Dharma, the teaching, the turn. It's called the turning of the wheel. So it's the first discourse and teaching given by the Buddha to his five closest friends, his five closest disciples after his enlightenment.
So this would be a really helpful image for teachers perhaps to start with in order to understand some of the core ideas. They could unpick each of these. I've certainly done that in my teaching in the past. And I think when I had first taught this with year sevens, we had looked at creating a set of rules, I guess, for create. We were remodeling a civilization. You know, what would be our core ideas underpinning it? And we went through that kind of process saying, you know, what are the problems with the world? What might be the solutions to that? And then what might guide an individual? And that's what took us to these kind of, and they created their own version of the Eightfold Path before I had told them anything about it. And they had come up with almost exactly these as being the core ideas that would guide us to have those right sort of interactions. And you know, some quick parallels with other faiths. You know, you could look at the Ten Commandments and say, okay, so how does that compare? You know, how do they contrast with the Eightfold Path, for instance? Now, you also mentioned the Four Noble Truths. So I mean, we could get into quite a lot of the different sets of teachings, rules, and so on. But can you just tell us briefly about the Four Noble Truths?
Yeah, the Four Noble Truths is crucial, really. And if ever I'm leading like an introduction course, I'll always start week one, sort of day one, is the Four Noble Truths. Um, I, before I actually go into the Four Noble Truths, I start with the four sights. Um, because for me, the four sights really explains the dilemma that the Buddha was come across. So the four sights are very quickly, the four sights are the fact that the Siddhartha Gautama, who was the Buddha before he gained enlightenment, was said to be a fairly well-off prince type thing. You know, his father was the head of a clan, certainly in northern India, borders of Nepal. And it's said that at one time he went out of the palace and he saw these four sights and they struck him very much indeed. So one of the sights is that he saw an old man, a very frail old man, and it's as if he's seen old age for the first time. I'm sure he's seen it before. Some of the stories will say he was so protected he had never seen this before, but it's probably like all of us, you know, through our teens and through our 20s and 30s, we're busy living life that we don't quite notice these things. So it's as if he's seen this for the first time. He's seen old age and he's realized this will happen to him. It will happen to all his loved ones. He saw somebody lying very ill and diseased in the street. So he's realized that illness and disease is basically a factor of, you know, this will happen or could happen to many people close to him. He then saw a funeral procession, you know, the body being taken to the cremation grounds, and the realization of death struck him very hard as well, realizing. And really his thoughts are, well, what's the point of all this wealth? What's the point of everything that I have if I don't understand through these three sights? And this will happen to us all. And then the fourth sight is that he saw a holy man wandering, you know, with a robe and begging bowl for his food. And he thought, maybe they know, maybe they can help me through this. So it was this sort of dilemma, I think, that Siddhartha Gautama had come across, is this sort of, he's got everything he could possibly wish to have, but he's feeling still dissatisfied. And these crucial questions of old age, illness, and death are beginning to kind of burn into him, really. So he goes forth, which is the other important aspect. He leaves all of that wealth in the palace and he goes forth. He sits eventually after much. So, you know, I know you're aware of asceticism, etc. We can explore that at some stage as well. But effectively, he ultimately sits under the Bodhi tree and decides, I'm not moving from this spot. I'll be in meditation until I actually see through these aspects of the four sights. And he gained enlightenment during that course of sitting under the Bodhi tree. He then found his 5 disciples, who had, of course, left him by this point because they felt he had given up the way, because he'd actually given up on asceticism and began to take some food on board and etc. And the very first discourse that the Buddha gave was the Four Noble Truths. So I would kind of say, when you think of all the knowledge perhaps that the Buddha may have gained, an understanding into reality, he had gained enlightenment, but the first teaching that he gave was the Four Noble Truths. So I think that's why it's so crucial, really, to us as Buddhists. This is what the Buddha decided to give, hence why it's called the turning of the wheel, that image that you showed before. This is the first turning of the Dharma, the first turning of the wheel. So that then kind of leads us into what the Buddha then said. And what he said is the first noble truth is dukkha. Dukkha is a really important word in Buddhism. We often try and translate things, don't we? We never quite capture the essence behind things. Dukkha is suffering, effectively. But a good way of thinking of it is it's just unsatisfactoriness with the way things are, that kind of sense, that feeling that there's still something not there. Of course, there's other aspects of dukkha. There's death. There's the aspects of the three of the four sights. All of those fall within that thing of dukkha. So yeah, so the first of the noble truths was just simply that the Buddha said, um, in life, being born of in this world, we do experience suffering. For me, I found that refreshing because everything in life, you go on your social media, you do whatever, all the adverts, everybody tells you that if your life should just be perfect. If just you had this, it would be just perfect. The shiny new whatever, you know. And for me, it's one of the first times somebody actually was quite open and honest and said, no, actually, life is like this at times. Of course, we're not saying it's like that all the time. There are pleasant things, aren't there? There are good things. But what he said is ultimately, because of impermanence, because everything's in a flux of change, ultimately, things will have an aspect of dukkha there. The important thing with this, though, after that, Ben, is the second noble truth, which is the reason why we experience dukkha. So the Buddha said we experience dukkha because of our wish to avoid dukkha. We look for that avoidance in the wrong places. So we try to grasp this or push away what we think we don't want, keep what we've already got. And really, the world's just too complex. We'll never really beat the world at that game. So it's this sort of grasping at things. It's not really, it can be described as ignorance. If you know, it's the wheel of life, the Tibetan wheel of life, at the very center that drives it all is the three things there, which is greed, hatred, and delusion, or ignorance. And that really is the second noble truth. But the third noble truth is the good news. What the Buddha said is, but there is a way from this. There is a way to be able to work and away from this experience, a strong experience of dukkha. So I always take the first noble truth and the second together in many ways. I say, because the way that we lead our lives, we experience dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or suffering. But the third noble truth is the Buddha just simply said, however, there is a way away from this. And that's what takes us on to the fourth noble truth, which is he gives us the Eightfold Path. And basically the Eightfold Path is if you follow these, adopt these as your way of life or your journey, etc., that experience of dukkha will lessen. We will always have an experience of dukkha, unless, of course, what they say is unless we gain enlightenment. However, what you do find, or what I find, is by following the Eightfold Path, the taste of dukkha, the flavor, just begins to loosen. It loses its kind of effect, whether it's the small stuff or even some of the big stuff that would normally just floor you. It will still rock you, but you can hold it a lot better than perhaps before. So yeah, I've said a lot there, and I think you've been trying to keep up with the slides. Sorry.
No, not at all. So, and I think that takes us back to that concept of Buddhism as a way of life without, and you haven't mentioned worship at any point, which is really interesting because I think that if we were talking about any other faith, we probably would have talked about connection with, well, obviously we would talk about connection with God and how that happens through worship. So within Buddhism, meditation forms that kind of that part of it, I guess, in that that's where you've got that still silent place, that place where you look for connection, that place where you improve relationship with between yourself and others and between yourself and the world. So maybe that might be an interesting parallel there. Now we've
Can I,
talked.
sorry, if I can just,
Please
we
do.
do have aspects of what you might call worship. We have puja. So puja is translated. It can be translated as worship or ritual. And so yeah, we will do what we call puja, which are sort of little ceremonies, and we will worship and we'll make offerings to the shrine. And really, a lot of that is about trying to break down this kind of particularly in the West. Um, we have this sort of we develop this sort of hard defense mechanism, don't we, to protect ourselves, really. And it can be quite tiring to maintain this aspect. And what's often said is part of what we do with puja and with meditation, actually, is we want to find the emotional equivalent to our intellect. We're very much intellectual, we're very much scientific, but that will only take us so far. We are still got that aspect of the emotional aspect, and that's what we want to try and connect, really. And puja can be a helpful way to just start to break that down. There's also an aspect of sangha with puja, because it's done, as your picture shows there, it's done with others. Somebody will lead, it'll be done in call and response. And it's about sangha building. It's about that community as well, being in practice with others. So you have the quiet aspect of meditation, and then you have the ritual and devotion, which is puja. Yeah.
And in this image here, actually, we see an image of a person. We see the Dalai Lama front and center there, I think.
Mm.
So within Buddhism, we do have humans who are responsible for guiding to some extent. Can you tell me very briefly what the role is of the Dalai Lama?
Well, the Dalai Lama, that is obviously, it's the Tibetan Buddhism, school of Buddhism. And he's recognized by there are actually 4 schools of Buddhism within Tibet. So when you talk about Tibetan Buddhism, there's actually, then it goes into there's 4 different actually sort of schools of Buddhism, even just within Tibetan Buddhism.
Well,
But
because people often think of, I think before you scratch the surface, you assume there's only one type of Buddhism.
yeah,
And sometimes the way into that question is seeing different images of the Buddha, which we'll talk about in a moment. But
yeah,
yeah, please do continue to tell us about the different schools.
yeah. Well, when you think of how similar to us, perhaps as many other religions, is it started with Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, then his 5 disciples, 2,500 years ago. If you then think how it would slowly spread, the word of the Dharma would spread, Buddhism would spread the teachings, etc. Slowly, it would meet other cultures over the centuries. So as it spreads, it would be absorbed with the culture and even some of the beliefs at the time. So when you think of it that way, you can then begin to get a flavor or a sense of some of the different schools of Buddhism you may have come across. So if you think of when Buddhism met the Japanese culture, what then came out and flourished is Zen Buddhism. And you can almost get a flavor, a little bit about how Zen operates. You think, well, and then you perhaps with the Japanese culture. Similarly, when Buddhism went to Tibet, that culture there. So you would have a different, it's a maybe a slightly different approach to how you do it, slightly different practices. Same with China. And then, of course, it goes down towards Thailand and Sri Lanka, etc. So in Thailand, it's what we more of a Theravadan style of Buddhism. So Theravadan Buddhism would be more the Pali Canon, the Dhammapada that we mentioned. So the word of the Buddha is what they would really practice with, is just the teachings directly from the Buddha. If you look at Tibetan Buddhism or Chinese Buddhism, the Mahayana school of Buddhism, that's the very sort of colorful imagery, different sort of imagery there as well. And it's just that different style. But it's understandable when you think, yeah, over centuries it met different cultures and it was able to do that. And of course, now Buddhism is in the West. So Buddhism will, again, it's going to take a slight change because it's meeting us in the West and our culture. Um, and what the Buddha said, and this is another thing that I quite like about Buddhism, is he said, whatever leads away from suffering, and the causes of suffering, that's my dharma. So it's not that he made it fixed that in a certain date and time and that you have to, it's specifically as it was 2,500 years ago. It has the ability to be able to transform or change with the times, really. And I think that's really quite important to understand as well. So the Dalai Lama, to get back to your original question, Ben, sorry. So the Dalai Lama is recognized as a one of the, I think, bodhisattvas of one of the schools of Tibet. He's recognized as a living reincarnation of a bodhisattva. So he's specific to, of course, Tibetan Buddhism, but of course he's much loved by everybody, isn't he? He's quite an impressive person. And one thing I always remember that I read something that he was asked, "What's the meaning of life, or what's the point of life?" And he said, "It's to be happy." As simple as that. And I really love that, actually.
There are lots of very pithy sound bites, but of course much more detailed. And he has a great deal to say, but I think he's often, as you say, becomes a popular figure on account of the way that he approaches things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think there's the one thing that I wanted to just point out. You touched upon it, but I just want to drive it home, I guess, a little bit. Was images of the Buddha, and so a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of the what's sometimes called the fat Buddha or the laughing Buddha. And if you contrast that with the images of the founder, if you like, Siddhartha Gautama, they're very different. So with Siddhartha Gautama, sometimes you see him emaciated with ribs exposed to show that point at which he's kind of eschewing the physical world in order to look for that deeper meaning. Often he's depicted looking content, that point at which he's discovered the middle way between too much and too little, to oversimplify there. And then the laughing Buddha here is more metaphorical, isn't it? The idea that this is about inner fulfillment, inner spiritual fulfillment, but depicted through an outer, how the Buddha is full with that idea of sort of spiritual fulfillment. The long earlobes were because at the time it was a sign of, at the time it was material wealth. You would have your ears hung with heavy gold jewelry that would have stretched the lobes, so they became a symbol of affluence. But here it's meant to represent spiritual fulfillment again. And sometimes you see I think that the laughing Buddha in Chinese culture is based on a monk called Pu Tai, I think. And so you can unpick that little. So we're gone quite deep into the theology here, but I think that what that does to demonstrate to us is, of course, that there's, like all faiths or belief systems, we've got lots of different components, we've got different branches, we've got a history, we've got stories, we've got rules or principles that guide behavior, we've got a core of people in Buddhism, the Sangha, who are kind of keeping who are representing a kind of a more committed group within the heart of it. So I think let's talk about what it's like to live your life as a Buddhist. What has changed for you now that what do you think that people need to know about living life as a Buddhist?
I think so. For me personally, it was that I had been reading into Buddhism for quite some time, for many years. And the reason I was drawn to it is I went on holiday to Thailand, Vietnam. I went into the temples, and I was just curious, really, and interested. And believe it or not, I wasn't interested in any religion whatsoever. But everything I read, sort of, for me anyway, personally, just made sense to me. So, but one thing it kept saying is you need to find out about meditation. Meditation is the way forward through this. And eventually I got to a point where I felt, yeah, I need to look further into this. Um, and also it was that sort of aspect for me personally is probably a bit like Siddhartha Gautama. You get to that point where you've ticked most of the boxes you're meant to in life. I've happily married, got children, got the mortgage, got a good job, etc. And then you get to that point, you still think, okay, but is there more? Is that lower sense of unsatisfactoriness, perhaps, that dukkha. And so I thought, okay, it's time to look into it. So that's what I did. I went along to the Colchester Buddhist Centre at the time. There wasn't one in Chelmsford, and learned to meditate. And the very first time I started to meditate, it was the Metta Bhavana, and that was it. Really, I thought, yes, yeah, this. I think this is a good way forward. Really. So what it means to me is really being able to gain that deeper understanding of the first noble truth, really, of dukkha, of that sense of unsatisfactoriness, and being able to release that in some way. And in doing that, the other things can kick in, the other things that people might go to meditation for, anxiety, stress, all those sort of things. You actually realize that if you just loosen the grip of trying to keep these things or grasp at these things, actually nothing bad happens, and actually your experience of life is just that little bit better than it was before, and it just continues with that. So my experience of this is one of greater, more peace and contentment with the way things are and what I have, instead of always craving for more and more, really, is the outcome of it. But everything that we've discussed there, I know we haven't discussed the 5 precepts in details, which is the ethical framework, but, the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, the meditation, our ethical sort of principles, framework, puja, these all interlink into the practice that we do, the journey that we're on. And over time, you just notice this sort of easing of the strain of life, really, of always having to kind of maintain and have the best of whatever's going around,
There's quite a simple idea there, isn't there? If you do this, then this will be the benefit to you.
Yeah.
And there's nothing unusual here. If a teacher was looking for parallels with other belief systems that they were more familiar, the use of intoxicants that features in all religions in all kinds of different ways, and wrong speech, misuse of the senses, clearly, and refrain from not stealing, taking life. And that takes you into discussion of vegetarianism, or your approach to the way that you should treat living things. So that could take us into a discussion about Buddhist responses to the environment, how you treat the environment. We could look at that. We could look at moral dilemmas, and we could apply Buddhism to those different things. But I think we wouldn't find anything that was particularly different to other religions. Would you agree with that? We've got to say, and I think that there was an interesting. I remember reading it was a book I was given many years ago called something like The Little Book of Kindness by the Dalai Lama, and it had a quote in it. It said something like, don't. It was advice to people like seeking to convert to Buddhism, and his advice was don't. He said, let's just look around. What is the convenient, if you like, religion or way of life where you live? Is it easier to be a Buddhist where you are, or is it easier to be a good Hindu? If so, be that, because the system around you will support you better in order to be a good Hindu in a Hindu place, a good Sikh in a Sikh environment, a Muslim
yeah,
in a Muslim country, or predominantly environment, then it would be to try and Buddhism's not going to answer some. Well, actually, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Buddhism's not going to answer some unfulfilled, but I think it probably will will do that for many people. So why did, and that's interesting, why have you become a Buddhist rather than, surely it would have been easier. I've seen how many churches there are in the Chelmsford area. Why haven't you just become a good Christian?
yeah. It probably would have been easy to find someone.
There's a very good Islamic center as well. There are all the options are available to you. Now, you have started to answer that question, and for you mentioned meditation, and
Yeah.
meditation is more at the core, and it's more developed as a practice within Buddhism than anything else. But was it something about a God as well? Because within all other faiths, you're deferring to a divine being, and that doesn't feature within Buddhism. So that probably makes a big difference for a lot of people. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that possibly was one of the main things. Um, just to say, I agree with everything you said that the Dalai Lama said in your little book there, which is when people come to the introduction course or the center, I'll always say to them that you don't have to be a Buddhist to come here. You take what you want and you leave what you don't want. And the other thing that we always, put the Buddha said, don't take my word for it. Just put it into practice. If it's helpful, do it. If it's not helpful, then don't do it. Leave it to one side. So it's a really good point, Ben. Yeah, to make. For me, it was this notion of God. I personally just didn't connect with that notion of a creating God. But when I read into Buddhism, what was there connected with me quite deeply, which is why I looked more into that. And I suppose if many of us, we do get to that point, do we? Where it's like I said earlier, is this it? Is this all there is? A bit like Siddhartha Gautama, I work hard, get my mortgage, pay it off, get ill and die, and is that it, or there must be something more, hopefully? And I suppose that's common throughout as well, isn't it? And whatever helps us, then that's the right place to go to, and that's the right way to go. So yeah, that's the reason why I drove distances to Colchester. Because actually I felt that this was probably more suitable and appropriate for me. Not for everybody, but certainly for me. So that's why, yeah.
Yet at the same time within Buddhism, that doesn't mean there are no supernatural elements, right? So there is more than the physical world. There's an idea of karma, a spirit or an essence that transfers from your physical form into some other physical form after death. It's not quite the same as Hinduism. In Hinduism, you draw very much a kind of a line. You might talk about my reincarnation within Hinduism, but I think you wouldn't use that kind of terminology. You wouldn't say I would like to come back as, within Buddhism. It's different. It's more like although I think when you scratch the surface in Hinduism, that's probably an oversimplification as well, because within Hinduism, that karma, that spiritual energy that exists within humans, eventually seeks to be reunited with Brahman, the ineffable, unimaginable creator God, and it sort of desires to go back to that being. So that actually isn't really attached to the individual at all. It's just often we find these oversimplifications happen when we're trying to explain it to somebody at a very low level, and we
Yeah,
kind of have to do that. We have to do it in the RE classroom all the time.
yeah,
We have to oversimplify because we can't cover it. We can't really get to it, and sometimes we don't have that deep understanding ourselves as well. But
mm,
could you tell me briefly about this idea of there being more than humans
yeah.
in
I,
Buddhism?
I think the aspect you were also referring to there is, so you mentioned karma, that's karma niyama, but karma niyama is only one of the five niyamas. So you have the first three, which is basically the Buddha said, well, within the world there's a number of forces that operate. So you've got the biological, you've got the inorganic, you've got the kind of the animal kind of instinct, so the fight or flight. It can be described as chitta mind, described as other things. That's the third. But then you've got karma niyama. So what the Buddha said is actually everything in body, speech, and mind, everything that we do in body, speech, and our thoughts, our mind, has an effect on the world around us. Cause and effect. Every action has a result. Every action has a cause. If it's a skillful action, benefit will come from that. If it's unskillful, aspects might change. But what you were referring to as well there, I think, could also be under the fifth, which is dharma niyama. So this is when the use of dharma is slightly different. Dharma niyama is more elusive, and perhaps one of the way I describe it is when you begin to practice as Buddhists, it's almost like before that we've been swimming across the stream or trying to swim upstream, and it's really hard work. But when we begin to maybe just adopt 5 precepts as training principles, when we meditate, when we break some of that stuff down, it's almost like we get swept along with the stream. And really what we're doing is we're just aligning ourselves with the way things are in the universe, the natural laws of the universe. We are just aligning ourselves with the flow. And the Dharma niyama then takes effect. It's very difficult to describe, but it's almost as if you're swept along with this, and things then just fall into place. You can almost say mysteriously or magically, but it's actually what we would say it's the Dharma, it's the effect of the Dharma niyama taking place. So there's those 5 aspects. The notion of God as well, just to say something about that, is within Buddhism. Within Buddhism, there's this view of it's the middle way, as you said. So you've got nihilism on one side, which is we're born, when we die, and when we die, that's it. There's nothing more. That would be nihilism. Well, the Buddha said, well, it's not like that. And then there's the view of eternalism, that there's something of me or that will forever be me and will always go. He said it's not like that. It's not. It's somewhere between. It's in the middle of these, sort of that middle way. That's the aspect, of course, of rebirth that you mentioned. And again, some of this, I always think it's like trying to pin jelly on a wall. Just as you maybe think you start to get an understanding, it kind of shifts again. You can never quite pin it down, but it's that sort of, it's somewhere in between those two that we believe. But when you talk about a creator God, etc., we believe it's somewhere in the middle between those two.
Okay, so we have got some big ideas with parallels with other religions. We have got some things that make Buddhism very, very different. I wonder if we could talk briefly about the questions that teachers might explore.
Okay.
So within theology, I think we've probably talked about many of the questions that teachers might consider from a theological perspective, because that draws upon all of the things that we have been discussing, the belief systems, the sources of information, the history, the how they do different things. We've really covered quite a lot of the philosophical questions that makes the kind of the idea of Buddhism different to other religions and similar to other religions. We talked about the idea of happiness. We've covered things like, is believing in God reasonable? We can explore that now from a Buddhist perspective, and so on. We've got things that touch upon the sanctity of life, rules about humans and animals and so on. So I think probably to spend a few minutes before we finish, just having a look at from a human and social sciences. Now, we could talk about festivals, but I think that's very easy for teachers to find information about festivals and how that's done. We have talked to some extent about how it might vary from one country to another, because
Mm.
faiths or belief systems evolve when they land somewhere. They adopt local customs and ideas, they merge with those, they take on different forms. So perhaps, and I don't know if there's any questions here that you think are particularly interesting for teachers to explore.
I'm at a disadvantage, Ben, because I'm on my mobile phone and
Yes, I did wonder. Okay, so I tell you what, let's then rather than looking at any of these questions in particular, because I think actually we've covered a great deal of these as well.
Mhm.
I wonder if we could talk about being getting a better understanding of Buddhism in the Essex area. Now, you've talked
Mm.
about the Colchester Centre, there's a centre in Chelmsford, there's a centre in Southend. If teachers wanted to get to understand more about Buddhism, if they wanted to go and talk to a Buddhist, to bring Buddhist
Mhm.
to their school, to get the children to encounter Buddhism, and even to to see puja, to see festivals and celebrations, and we've got London not far away. What would you advise teachers to do?
Yeah, no, we're now based. We have a centre in Chelmsford, and as you say, there's one in Colchester as well. So we we have someone in our Sangha who's happy to go into schools. Obviously, our time is slightly limited, but she's more than happy to do that. We are also happy to have visits to the centre as well. We can make arrangements for that. And also, we're happy to speak to if there's any clarification on any points or topics that anybody has, then just get in contact with us. We have got the websites, and our contact details are on the website. So feel free to make contact if there's any sort of questions that need answering, etc., or clarification. So yeah, we're very happy to assist where we can, and as we can. So yeah, just make contact, I would say, if you wish to.
Fabulous. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. And I'm sure we will be coming back with more questions and requests for guidance at various points. Um, okay, I'm going to stop.
You're welcome. Thanks, Ben.